Welcome to our discussion of the executive branch of the Texas government. And I'm not going to lie to you, this is not a very exciting subject. This is not my most favorite branch of government. I would say this is my third most favorite branch of government. And yes, I do have a ranking of my favorite branches of government, and probably the topic that I'm not super jazzed to talk about, because the executive branch, as you'll see, is a lot of bureaucracy, and it's just kind of a lot of committees, and it feels a little less formal than the other branches. But that said, it is still one of the three branches of government in Texas, and so we need to talk about it. Going back to our 35,000-foot view of the three different branches, the legislative branch makes laws, the House and the Senate. The executive branch enforces the laws through the governor, lieutenant governor, and others, and the judicial branch interprets the laws. So that's the judges. So we're on the second executive branch, the governor, lieutenant governor. Kind of an overview of what we're going to talk about in this lecture is some basics of the executive branch, the power that the governor has, the bureaucracy, which is the, it's not a negative term, it is just what the term we use to discuss the elected and appointed officials and different boards and things like that that work within the executive branch. And then we're going to talk about relationships and accountability in the bureaucracy and within the executive branch. So let's talk about Texas's executive branch. Texas has a plural executive, which just means that we have a lot of people who share power in the executive branch. And as you have seen as a recurring theme in Texas government, we elect all of them. So none of this, we elect the governor and he appoints the lieutenant governor and the attorney general, things like that. So the voters elect all of the different levels of this executive branch. And just so you know, these are the names of the different people in the executive branch. So there's a governor, Greg Abbott, lieutenant governor, Dan Patrick, the attorney general, Ken Paxton, the comptroller of public accounts, Glenn Hager, the commissioner of agriculture, Sid Miller, and then the commissioner of the general land officer, land office, George P. Bush. So a few things. These are important names to remember. This is the kind of thing that I really want you to write down in the notes, and it's the thing I want you to remember. Because you'll hear things like, well, Ken Paxton's in trouble again. And you're like, who is that guy? Well, he's the Attorney General of Texas. I want you to know, be able to know the governor and the lieutenant governor of Texas. And another thing, George P. Bush, yes, he is related to all of those other George Bushes. And so we'll talk about him a little bit more in a bit. To be governor in Texas, you must be at least 30 years old, a citizen of the United States, and a resident of Texas for 5 years. That's the official requirement. The unofficial requirement, if you're looking at history and what is an attribute that is most likely going to be in our governor, is you're probably going to be Anglo, male. You're probably going to have a background in law or business. You're probably going to have a record of public service. Now you're likely to be a Republican, and you're probably also going to have access to money so that you can raise money for things that you want to do. We have had 2 women as governor of Texas. We had Ann Richards. We also had Miriam Ferguson, Ma Ferguson. But remember that there's kind of an asterisk by her name as, you know, one of the 2 women governors of Texas, because her whole platform in running for governor was that she would let her husband, who was impeached and banned from holding office, call the shots. So since 1900, more than 50% of the governors in Texas have been lawyers. And in 2014, when you want to talk about access to money, in 2014, when Abbott ran for office, he spent about $49 million, and Wendy Davis spent about $46 million on their campaigns. So you have to have some access to some real money. Now the governor serves a 4-year term. He or she does not have any term limits. The pay for governor is $153,750 a year. This is a full-time job. This is not something that you have to have another part-time job or another full-time job on top of it. One of the perks, or some of the perks, is that you have access to living in the governor's mansion. You have a residential expense account, which is not part of the $153,000 a year, and that pays for staff at the mansion and maintenance to the mansion. You have your own professional staff and your own security detail, and that is also not part of the $153,000. That's on top of all that. If the governor is impeached or removed, then the lieutenant governor serves, and then the Senate, who the lieutenant governor presides over, would choose somebody to fill the lieutenant governor's space. So if something happened to Greg Abbott and he was no longer able to serve as governor, then Dan Patrick, the lieutenant governor, would step into the governor's shoes, and then the Senate would choose a lieutenant governor. Rick Perry is the longest serving governor of Texas. He served for 14 years and 1 month. And he was somebody who was a lieutenant governor. And when George W. Bush, stepped out of the governor's seat in order to be president, then Rick Perry took over and became the governor of Texas. And then he was the incumbent then, and so was able to be reelected a number of times. Now this is a picture of the governor's mansion. Gorgeous. It's been the official residence of the governor since 1856. Now in 2009, when Rick Perry was in office, an act of arson was committed, and it, really destroyed a big chunk of the mansion, but it didn't hurt anybody because it was empty at the time, having some repairs done, some plumbing and electrical, and interestingly enough, fire sprinklers installed. It has been fully restored after that act of arson. And that's what it looked like when it was burned. So let's talk about term limits for a minute. Term limits is a big thing that people like to discuss. As far as, is it something that's good? Is it something that's bad? There are a number of states with a number of different approaches to this for their governors. You can see the ones in kind of the off-white have no term limits. Some have, you can have 2 consecutive terms, or 2 terms within a certain number of years, or 2 lifetime terms. Some have 1 consecutive term limit, so you can't, serve basically you can't serve more than one consecutive term, but you can serve non-consecutive terms. These are, there's a lot of different discussions on whether this is good or bad. Do you want somebody who is a fresh face that's in the governor's seat to provide, a good new view on certain things? You don't want somebody who's a career politician, or do you want somebody who has been doing the job of the governor for a long time and knows the ropes and knows what's going on and is able to help the state run smoothly? There's no right answer. It's just these are things that are discussed. The governor has a staff. The governor does not do all of the governor's work. One of the largest states in the country by himself or herself. The governor's staff will evaluate appointees. The governor makes several hundred appointments every year. There's different boards, there's different committees, there's different judicial offices that need to be filled. And so there is a staff that evaluates different people who are up for appointment. The staff is a liaison with the legislature. So Greg Abbott is not sitting in a chamber of the House or the Senate every day to see what they're doing. The legislature will meet with his staff to get his opinion on bills or explain bills to him and kind of talk through things with the governor's staff in order to determine whether the bill would have support, things like that. There's a staff that prepares the budget, a staff that administers the schedule, and part of the staff is a liaison with the local and regional governments. So trying to make sure that local governments are acting in a way consistent with state goals. Okay, so we're going to move on now to the governor's powers. So let's talk about the formal powers. Those are the powers that come from the Constitution. So you can read the Constitution and see what formal powers the governor has. There are also informal powers that are just powers that the governor has that are derived from other powers that are in the Constitution. So it's not found in any written law or written rule, but it's implied. The powers are: the governor is the chief of state, the chief of party, has legislative powers, and is the chief executive. We're going to go through each of those separately. So first, let's talk about the chief of state. The chief of state, there's a symbolic portion to this, which just means, if you think of Texas and a representative of Texas, you think of the Texas governor. They're the first citizen. If somebody is going to represent Texas on a national stage or international stage, it's going to be the governor. They're, an international liaison, so Greg Abbott meets with representatives from Mexico a lot because we have international relationship when we share our border. Going back to some of the symbolic powers, the Texas governor will visit disaster areas if there's been a tornado or a hurricane, and kind of offer, will survey the area, but also offer support to the people that are there. There will be fairs and parades and things like that, and sometimes the governor participates in those as the head of Texas. The governor is a liaison to other states. So if, for example, somebody is arrested in Texas, but California really wants to try that person as for crimes in California, then the governor of California will call the governor of Texas and ask for extradition of a prisoner or something like that. But, you know, if Texas and Oklahoma are having some sort of a dispute over a piece of land on our border, then sometimes the governors will meet together, the governor's offices will meet together to try to talk things out and make sure that we can all get along. And then finally, the governor is a liaison to the federal government. So the governor will be the voice of Texas when we need some sort of federal aid, like if there is a huge hurricane that hits and we need some federal funds to help us with the disaster, then the Texas governor will ask for that. We'll go to the federal government for that. The Texas governor is also the chief of the party on both the state and the national level. So Greg Abbott is involved in the Republican Party. On the state level, as kind of the head of the state, not official, but unofficial state Republican Party, and also important in the national Republican Party. So let's go into the legislative powers of the governor. There's the message power. So like State of the Union, the governor will issue a State of the State message, and sometimes he can focus on something that he wants passed, a bill he wants passed, or something that he thinks is important. The governor can also contact the legislature and kind of let something that, an issue that is needs to be accelerated, a bill that needs to be accelerated, the governor can put this, designate this as an emergency item, and that allows the bill to leapfrog to the, to the front of the calendar. The governor is the chief budget officer of the state, and so the governor comes up with the budget and then sends it to the legislature, and the legislature has to deal with it from there. The governor has veto power. There have been, a couple of thousand of vetoes since World War II, and only one has been overridden, and that was a bill in 1979 that said that Comal County could establish its own hunting and fishing regulations, and the governor said no, and the legislature said, actually, we're going to override that veto. So it is hard to override a veto, and it's also hard because the governor has power. The governor has not only the power of veto, but the threat of a veto. So if before a bill even gets to his desk, the governor can say, look, I'm going to veto that bill if it gets here, so you better fix it to be something that I want it to be, or that's something that I would be willing to sign, or I'm not signing it. And so sometimes he can influence what a bill looks like by just threatening to veto. If it's an appropriations bill, so a bill that has to do with giving money to a certain committee or something like that, the governor has a line item veto power, and that just lets the governor strike, certain items that the governor does not want to receive money from the bill, and the rest of the bill can pass. The governor calls special sessions of the legislature, and again, those things are expensive, and so he only calls them when they're necessary. And the governor can put together task forces in case, if there's like a task force on drug use or education or something like that, which is just a special legislative group that is going to focus on a certain problem that the governor, or a certain issue the governor finds very important. So the governor is also the chief executive of the state. And what this means is that the governor appoints people to different boards or commissions or benches, judicial benches, and can also appoint some to their staff. They usually get to appoint about 3,000 people in a 4-year term. So during his first term, Abbott appointed people to 276 boards and 12 different judges, and then also staff members. He can remove, if he has appointed somebody to a board or appointed somebody somewhere, he can remove that person for cause if the Senate agrees. But like we talked about before, if somebody else has appointed the person, if the previous governor has appointed the person, then the current governor cannot just remove the person on his own. He can remove some minor administrators and some people in his office without the consent of the Senate. The chief executive listens to lobbies. He listens to, the senators. He talks to the senators so that they're all on the same page as far as political appointments and things like that. The law enforcement power of the governor as the chief executive is that he appoints the 5-person Public Safety Commission, who chooses the head of the Department of Public Safety, and that is the person who is in charge of the Texas Rangers and the Texas Highway Patrol, so kind of the head of all law enforcement in Texas. So that's a pretty big law enforcement power. So that would be Greg Abbott appoints the 5-person Public Safety Commission, and then that Public Safety Commission then chooses the head of the Texas Rangers and the Texas Highway Patrol. Greg Abbott's military power is that he is the commander-in-chief of the state militia, and he appoints the person that oversees them, the Texas National Guard and the Texas State Guard. The State Guard is about 3,000 people that are mobilized by the governor, so the governor just calls them in whenever they're needed. And the Texas National Guard is about 18,000 people, and it can be mobilized by the President of the United States. So if there's a declared, state of emergency, or the National Guard or the State Guard are needed to keep the peace, then that is the military power of the executive. Clemency power, the governor has unlimited power to issue, sorry, that's not unlimited power. He has limited power to issue pardons and reprieves. The Board of Pardons and Paroles is the one that actually looks at the request for a pardon or a reprieve or a parole and makes a recommendation to the governor, and then the governor can be more strict but not less strict. So if somebody wants, if somebody wants a full pardon of a crime, and that is recommended by the Board of Pardons and Paroles, the governor can be more strict about it and say, no, only a limited or only a partial pardon, but could not be less strict by saying, I'm not only going to pardon you of this crime, but pardon you of all crimes, or something like that. The governor can also give a 30-day reprieve from execution. So that is a lot of times when somebody is scheduled for execution, you'll hear that they are, contacting the governor to see if the governor is going to step in and issue a reprieve. And that's, one of the one of the powers. So there are other executives that are established by the Constitution, not just the governor, but there's also the lieutenant governor, the comptroller, attorney general, and the commissioner of the general land office. And those are the people we talked about earlier. So which of these powers is the most important? It is not, that is something that is up for debate. This is not something that has an answer to it, but it's just something that when you think about somebody who is going to be elected as governor, remember that these are all the different parts of the executive power that the governor has. So there is a kind of a discussion on what would make the ideal governor, and some there's just a giant debate what would make the ideal governor. Would an active governor who's adaptive, somebody who's self-confident, flexible, creates ways to take action, enjoys power, doesn't take themselves too seriously, and so basically not narcissistic. They're optimistic, they use their powers for good, those kinds of things. That would be, an active governor. If there was an active governor that had a negative bent, it would be somebody who's compulsive. They would have, they would use their power to make themselves feel better and to do things that they wanted to do. They would spend a lot of money, a lot of time and energy on certain things, becoming certain governmental tasks, but that wouldn't really bring them any joy, and they wouldn't really enjoy their job. They would be preoccupied with whether or not something that they were doing as governor was going to help them or hurt them later. Low self-esteem, again, narcissistic. They would probably be pessimistic, rigid, aggressive, driven, which is not terrible, but driven to the point of, letting other parts of their life suffer. A passive governor, if it's a good thing, a positive aspect of a passive governor is somebody who's compliant. They seek to be loved. They can be manipulated, which can be good if you just want the governor to be a figurehead and the real power to lay somewhere else in government. They may have low self-esteem. They may, have a kind of a reactive instead of a proactive reaction to things, or kind of way that they conduct their job, and they may be superficially optimistic. So they will appear happy and appear to say things are going well, but not necessarily be able to back that up. And finally, if it's a passive personality type, negatively, that person could be withdrawn. They don't want to take responsibility or power. They may respond instead of initiate. They'll avoid conflict or uncertainty, and just, only respond to things that they have to do. So this is something you can kind of look at, studies of past governors, and see what, where did past governors fall, and what were the results of that? Was it good for the state? Was it bad for the state? But this is just when you wonder about what political scientists talk about, this is the kind of thing they talk about. So we have talked about the basics of the executive branch and the governor's powers. So let's talk about the bureaucracy, which is just the rest of the people who are the elected and appointed officials. So we talked about this slide earlier. These are the different people that the voters elect in Texas that are part of the executive branch. So there is the elected bureaucracy, the lieutenant governor, the attorney general, comptroller of public accounts, commissioner of agricultural, commissioner of the general land office, and then there are the appointed bureaucrats. So the secretary of state, the adjutant general, which is the person who's in charge of the Texas National Guard and the Texas State Guard, the health and human services commissioner, insurance commissioner, and the commissioner of education in Texas. So people use the word bureaucracy to basically describe government, like the bad part of government, the thing that keeps government from working. But this doesn't necessarily mean that, not all parts of the bureaucracy are bad. It has a negative connotation just from, basically it just has bad press. But a bureaucracy is just something in government that's complex and large. There's a hierarchical, sorry, I really have a problem with that word, structure, meaning that there's, power at the top, and then as you go down the structure, power and control of whatever the topic is lessened. A bureaucracy is partisan, so it is controlled by people of similar political party, and there are alliances within the bureaucracy, within the parties. And there's usually somebody with specialized expertise. So somebody, when they talk about a bureaucrat, you usually think of somebody who has been in the government position for a number of years. And while that might be bad, it does give them a specialization on a certain kind of expertise they may have. It's not private. It is something that is governmental. It's not neutral, meaning that it's partisan, and it's not merit-based. So you don't progress based on how good you are. You progress based on how long you've been in the government. So many state governments adopt a merit system, which uses kind of objective qualities in order to hire somebody and promote somebody, but Texas doesn't. Texas uses a bureaucratic approach, which is the longer you've been there, the higher up you go. So let's talk about the lieutenant governor. This is Dan Patrick. He will serve for 4 years. He's the president of the Texas Senate. He serves on the Legislative Budget Board, the Legislative Council, and the Legislative Audit Committee. And if the governor cannot serve, then he serves as governor. So this is somebody that the voters elect, and you see why it's important to elect somebody good, because God forbid something happened to the governor, then the lieutenant governor would step in. The Attorney General is Ken Paxton. He also served for 4 years. He is the lawyer for officials, boards, agencies within Texas. He assists with child support enforcement and antitrust actions. So if there is a monopoly, he will step in and try to bust that up. He is instrumental in the Crime Victim Compensation Fund, which means it's a fund that will help out people who have been a victim of a crime. He is involved in consumer protection, so he will sue on behalf of maybe a segment of Texans who have, had some sort of an injury or some sort of problem because of a company. He watches insurance, banking, and security companies and those sectors to make sure that there's no monopolies forming, there's no fraud, there's, that everybody is conducting business in accordance with the law. And then he also investigates Medicaid fraud. What he does is give advisory opinions, so he'll just say what he thinks the Constitution or the rules that were enacted by committee or laws mean. Those are not binding. They just are kind of an indication of what he thinks as, Texas's top lawyer. And he represents the state if there's some sort of federal regulation, like voter ID law was a problem. When that went up to the Supreme Court, he represented the state of Texas, or his office did. If the state is being charged with the violation of environmental laws, his office will handle defense of the state. If there's some sort of a boundary dispute, like with New Mexico or Louisiana or Oklahoma, he would represent Texas. So Ken Paxton, though, has had all kinds of fraud charges filed against him based on his work as a financial advisor and in the securities industry. It's been refiled a few times and dismissed a few times, but you'll see him in the news a lot just because his name is attached to a lot of defense of the state or prosecution on behalf of the state of Texas. Okay, the Comptroller of Public Accounts. This is Glenn Hagar. He served for 4 years. He's the chief tax collector in Texas. He is the chief pre-audit accounting officer. So the accounting officer that's not an auditor. He certifies the state's revenue for the balanced budget. So he says how much revenue Texas has because that's the limit to the amount of money that Texas can spend. He manages the college funds and provides information to the other branches of government and also within the executive branch on the money, public money and spending. The Commissioner of Agriculture, I absolutely love this picture of Sid Miller just because that is exactly like straight out of central casting, what you would expect the Commissioner of Agriculture in Texas to look like. He served for 4 years, oversees the Texas Department of Agriculture, which is involved in research, education, regulation of agricultural issues. He serves as the Texas Agricultural Finance Authority. So when agricultural businesses need financing, he is involved in that. And he administers agricultural laws. So laws on farming and hunting and all those kinds of things. But it also, he's the person who has to certify the scanners at the grocery store or the gas pumps, things like that. He has to, or his office has to review labeling for pesticides. He is involved in giving grants and loans to farmers and involved in labor laws relating to farming. And then just also promotes Texas and their agricultural offerings in the scope of, the United States. Okay, the Commissioner of the General Land Office is George P. Bush. He is from the Jeb Bush part of the family. He will serve for 4 years, and his job is to manage and collect income from rentals and leases on state-owned land. And so, if there's public property that has mineral income or mineral leases, then he manages that and has to manage it well and make sure it goes to the right places. He enforces the Texas Open Beaches Act, which just means that you have access to public beaches, and serves on the School Land Board and the Veteran Land Board. The School Land Board is what benefits from the mineral leases and other leases, the income that is collected from the 13 million acres of public property in Texas, and all that money goes into the permanent school fund. And then the Veterans Land Board loans money to vets for home purchases or home improvement, and then there's 4 veteran cemeteries in Texas, and it manages those. So we've talked about the bureaucracy, the elected bureaucracy. So now let's talk about the appointed bureaucracy. So the appointed bureaucracy, the Texas Secretary of State is the chief notary. That person publishes the government rules and regulations, is a liaison for Texas-Mexico border affairs, and the chief international protocol officer, also the chief election officer, maintains a repository of records. So all kinds of records are kept with the Secretary of State, and serves at the pleasure of the governor. So the governor can appoint and remove the Secretary of State. The Adjutant General is somebody who serves a 2-year term appointed by the governor, and that person administers the Texas National Guard and the Texas State Guard that we talked about earlier. The Health and Human Services Commissioner is the person in charge of the health and human services system, and there is extensive administrative and policy making power in this office. The Insurance Commissioner is somebody who serves a 2-year term, and that person monitors the solvency of different insurance companies, make sure that they're not just selling insurance but not have the money to back it up, prosecutes violators of insurance law, makes sure that agents are properly licensed, and if there are complaints, investigates those, and then keeps a lot of statistics to provide to the insurance industry. The Commissioner of Education is the educational leader of the state, is in charge of the Texas Education Agency, serves a 4-year term, and is just in charge of, or is the liaison to the governor of the educational system in Texas. A few more people in the bureaucracy. Elected part of the executive branch, the Texas Railroad Commission. That is 3 different commissioners that serve overlapping 6-year terms, sorry. They not only deal with the railroad throughout Texas, but they deal with all wheeled carriers, so any kind of regulation of semi-trucks, and also they are in charge of regulations for oil and gas pipelines and drilling, and the enforcement of those. And so they talk about, they deal with the disposal and the pumping and those kinds of things as they relate to oil and gas. The State Board of Education is a board that serves overlapping 4-year terms, and they are in charge of the policy and the curriculum that surrounds public education in Texas. So they decide, do we take standardized tests? What kind of standardized tests do we take? What does that mean for whether or not you can graduate if you pass the test, things like that. Some appointed boards that are in the bureaucracy, the Public Safety Commission, which again appoints the person who is, the Public Safety Commission appoints the person who is in charge of the Texas Rangers, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, the Department of Transportation, the Board of Criminal Justice, and there are some ex officio boards that within the bureaucracy and within the executive branch that are staffed with elected officials. And so sometimes there will be a board that will say that, well, this board is made up of the governor, the, lieutenant governor, and the attorney general. And then that board then would, this year would have Dan Patrick, Greg Abbott, and Ken Paxton on it. So that's what an ex officio board is. Okay, so we've talked about the basics of the executive branch, the governor's powers, the bureaucracy, and now we're going to talk about relationships and accountability as they relate to the executive branch. So the different agencies and different boards in the executive branch are independent of the governor, even though the governor may have some appointment power in those branches. They appoint policy-making boards and commissions, and they control the information that is released, but also is given to these different agencies. Interest groups do influence committees and committee appointments. They will, give money to committees that they want to enact certain regulations or free them from regulations, maybe take away some regulations. Agencies sometimes are allied with clientele groups, so that is a group that's just directly affected by the agency program. So like a clientele group of the Department of Defense for the federal government would be a defense contractor, something like that. Sometimes an agency is completely taken over by its clientele group, and so everybody on the agency is, or everybody in the agency is employed by somebody from the clientele group. Committees need interest groups because they want to have a job after they have finished serving on the committee. They want to have funding for their committees, and they need somebody to pay for research and data and offering advice for different rules that can be enacted by the committee. Now, who are bureaucrats ultimately responsible to or accountable to? The people, the voters. The voters are the ones that hire or fire bureaucrats. So hire and fire Greg Abbott and Ken Paxton. But only the people who vote have that power. So if you don't vote, then you don't have the power to say who is governor. It's just logic. Bureaucrats are also accountable to the legislature, so they have to make sure that everything that they do can survive an audit of the legislature or its committees. They also have to make sure that they are providing or they are acting in a way that is consistent with what the legislature has told them the money should go for in certain instances. They are accountable to the governor because they're either directly appointed by the governor or the governor appointed the committee that appointed the person. In the federal cabinet, as we've seen in the Trump administration, the federal cabinet is just appointed by Trump and in some cases confirmed by the Senate, and then can be removed by Trump at a whim. And then bureaucrats also have to be responsible to follow certain rules like that ensure transparency, like open meetings. This is something that you notice if you go to a school board meeting, that there has to be a certain part of the meeting that is an open meeting that everybody can listen to so they can know what's going on. There has to be an open records provision that, you know, these different bureaucratic committees have to open their records to the public so that people can really see what's going on in the committee or in the group. The committees or the bureaucratic committees have to sometimes have an ombudsman, which is a person who just oversees the complaints against that committee or that group and holds them accountable. And also whistleblowers. That's a whistleblower is somebody who is protected if they make a complaint or if they expose some sort of wrongdoing or bad action or corruption or favoritism or something like that that's happening within the committee. So the bureaucrat has to be accountable to the public and, you know, has to be ultra transparent so that the public can have faith in that system. And so this is the kind of the last thing I wanted to talk about, and it is it's called the Iron Texas Star model, and that is just, it kind of just shows the relationship between different parts of the bureaucracy. So you can see how they all report to each other, are beholden to each other, relate to each other. They, you know, bargain with each other to make sure that, you know, they are all kind of acting in the certain, kind of in the same direction. You can look and see kind of where the public can be involved. So with special interest groups or elections, things like that, is where the public can have the most access. You can see where different parts of the bureaucracy can be subject to or susceptible to corruption or abuse of power if there's not, you know, a whole lot of involvement from other kind of pieces of the star. And you can see where, you know, interest groups need to target, you know, what they don't need to target only the governor. They need to target all different different areas for their lobbying in order to help get laws passed. Okay, I totally lied. This is another thing we need to talk about is administrative law, and that's part of something that comes out of the executive branch and all of the different committees and subcommittees and things like that. Administrative law is just rules and regulations written by administrators, so not written by the Texas legislature, not written by the courts, and it's laws that help implement public policy. It's kind of a first pass at how a law is going to be enforced. And it kind of shows, you know, how if a law is passed by the legislature, then how would it actually play out? Who would benefit from it? Who would it really hurt? These are not things that are set in stone. They can be overturned by the court. They can be overturned by the legislature. And when the legislature enacts a law that is, you know, kind of preempts the administrative law. And there is a review of all administrative laws. So zoning laws, EPA laws, Social Security laws, licenses, things like that. They are reviewed by the committees and by the administration. So when we talk about agencies, different agencies and who they are accountable to, agencies are accountable to people if they were elected, but they're indirectly accountable to people if they were appointed by somebody who's elected. So if an agency member is appointed by the governor, then they are indirectly accountable to the voters, because the voters are the ones who choose the governor. They're accountable to the legislature. If the agency is subordinate to the legislature, then the legislature is completely responsible for the agency and the agency's actions. But also, an agency cannot take action that violates a legislative law. If the person was appointed by the governor, then the governor, if the agency was appointed by the governor, then the governor is responsible for how the agency acts. And how do we see this accountability, or how is this accountability maintained? Through transparency, like we talked, open meetings that are public, but also meetings that are not, secretly called or called with nobody told that they were going to happen. Open records, so you can review the records of different agencies. Protection of whistleblowers, which we talked about, as far as if somebody in the agency or somebody outside of the agency reports some wrongdoing by the agency, then that person can't be retaliated against because they're a whistleblower. And then finally, the appointment of an ombudsman, which is somebody who's just kind of a neutral third party who will look at complaints and take complaints about that agency. So the agency is not left to just police themselves. So that is the Texas executive branch. And like I said, not super thrilling, but something super important, because you can see that they're a third of the government. They are have a lot of power to appoint a whole lot of people. And so these are important people that we need to know about, know what they do, know the reach of their power before we go vote.